The moon cast eerie shadows on the billionaire's estate as his dog, Winston, sat unmoving, eyes glinting with something unnatural. When the FBI took him, they thought he was just a trained pet. But Winston had secrets, ones that could change history. The mansion stood on the edge of the Pacific, a fortress of glass and steel, perched like a god above the crashing waves. Inside its walls, wealth was omnipresent. Hand-woven Persian carpets, original Monets, crystal chandeliers that refracted light into endless golden shards. And yet, for all his riches, Victor Lancaster sat alone, untouched by the warmth of it all. He had everything the world could offer. A billion-dollar tech empire, the power to bend industries to his will. An empire built on the back of artificial intelligence. But none of it filled the silence in his home. None of it replaced the absence he never spoke of. The only sound in the cavernous mansion was the gentle clicking of nails against marble floors. Winston. Winston wasn't an ordinary dog. He was an anomaly, an impossibility wrapped in golden fur. A Labrador retriever with eyes too knowing, movements too precise. He never barked without reason, never made a wrong step, and when he looked at Victor, it was as if he were studying him. Not like a pet, but like an equal. Victor had raised Winston from a pup, but over the years, he'd realized something unsettling. Winston was different. Too different. His intelligence surpassed any animal Victor had ever encountered. It was a quiet intelligence, the kind that lurked beneath the surface, waiting to be understood. One evening, as the sun melted into the horizon, Victor sat in his leather chair, swirling a glass of bourbon, watching Winston. The dog sat across from him, unmoving, staring at the fireplace like he was deep in thought. Victor exhaled, setting his glass down. "You know, Winston." His voice was weary. "I never wanted all this." Winston's ears flicked, but he didn't turn. He was listening. He always listened. Victor reached into his pocket, pulling out a worn photograph. The edges were frayed, the ink faded, but the image burned into his soul. A woman, dark hair, bright eyes, laughing beneath a sycamore tree. Next to her, a younger Victor, smiling in a way he no longer knew how. "You would have liked her," Victor murmured. She loved animals. Would have spoiled you rotten." The fire crackled, filling the silence. Winston's gaze shifted slightly, and for the briefest moment, Victor felt it. That connection. Not of a man and his pet, but of two beings carrying something heavy. Victor sighed, folding the photograph carefully, tucking it back into his pocket. "She would have told me I was crazy," he said, running a hand through his graying hair. "That I was imagining things." He looked at Winston, lips curling in an almost smile. "But I know what you are, and I know what they want from you." Winston didn't blink. Beyond the mansion walls, the world was closing in, and tomorrow, the FBI would come knocking. The morning air was heavy with salt and the distant hum of waves, but inside the mansion, an unnatural stillness filled the space. Victor sat at his grand mahogany desk, staring at the blinking cursor on his computer screen, though his mind was elsewhere. Winston lay on the Persian rug near his feet, his golden coat catching the light from the floor-to-ceiling windows. He wasn't asleep, Victor could tell. His breathing was too controlled, his ears twitching ever so slightly at sounds beyond human perception. Victor exhaled, rubbing his temples. He had spent the past decade designing the world's most advanced artificial intelligence systems, but none of them baffled him the way Winston did. The dog's uncanny intelligence had always been something he ignored, wrote off as coincidence, or worse, his own imagination. But the truth gnawed at him. Winston wasn't just smart. He was something else entirely. The first time Victor had noticed it, Winston was barely a year old. The dog had watched him solve complex equations on a whiteboard, sitting motionless for hours. The next morning, Victor had woken up to find his mathematical notations rearranged, improved. It had been a fluke, he told himself. A random occurrence. But then, there was the chessboard. Victor had been deep in thought, mid-game against himself, when he stepped away for a call. When he returned, the game had changed. A single move had been made. Bishop to a5. A move that Victor hadn't considered, but one that led to a flawless checkmate 4 turns later. And then, there were the nights Winston would disappear into the estate's vast library, returning only at dawn, his nose pressed against old pages as if he were reading. It wasn't normal. It wasn't natural. And now, someone else had noticed. A sharp knock shattered the silence, and Victor's stomach tightened. He glanced at Winston, who had already risen, standing at alert, ears perked. Another knock. More forceful. Victor swallowed hard, rising from his chair. He smoothed his shirt, forcing a breath through his nose before making his way to the grand entrance. Through the frosted glass panels, he saw them. 3 figures in dark suits, standing rigid, their presence unmistakable, the FBI. Victor unlocked the door, pulling it open. The agent in front, a woman with steel gray eyes and a badge clipped to her belt, gave him a tight-lipped nod. "Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice clipped and professional. "We need to talk." Victor held her gaze, his pulse steady despite the storm brewing inside him. "This is about Winston, isn't it?" he asked. Behind him, the dog stood still as stone. The agent hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then she nodded. "Yes, we need your dog." Victor's grip on the door tightened. He had known this moment would come. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Winston had already made his decision, and the world would never be the same. The ocean mist clung to the morning air as Victor Lancaster stood in the doorway of his mansion, his heart pounding against his ribs. The 3 agents in black suits watched him with the patience of vultures, their expressions impassive, yet their presence carried an undeniable weight. At his feet, Winston sat motionless, his golden coat almost shimmering under the pale light. The dog's amber eyes flickered between Victor and the lead agent, dissecting the moment, analyzing every word, every breath, every hesitation. Victor had always been a man of reason, of numbers and logic. But this was something else entirely. "You still haven't told me why you need him," Victor said, keeping his voice level. The lead agent, the one with sharp cheekbones and cold, steel-gray eyes, let out a slow breath. "Because he's not just a dog, Mr. Lancaster." Victor folded his arms. "Then what is he?" The agent hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. Then, without a word, she reached into her coat and pulled out a sleek black folder. She flipped it open and turned it toward him. Victor's stomach knotted. The photographs inside weren't just surveillance pictures. They were proof of something impossible. Winston was in every single one. A high-security conference in Switzerland, a classified military facility in Nevada, a city street, standing motionless beside an unmarked car with a man Victor recognized, a man who had supposedly vanished off the grid years ago. Victor's blood ran cold. He flipped through the photos, heart hammering. Winston wasn't just there. He was always in the right place at the right time, watching, observing. But that wasn't what sent shivers down Victor's spine. It was the way Winston looked in every image. Not like a dog that had wandered into the frame, like a spy. "You think he's been... what? Gathering intelligence?" Victor scoffed, but the unease in his voice betrayed him. The agent's jaw tightened. "You already know the answer to that." Victor shook his head, trying to force logic into something that had none. "That's impossible. He's just..." His words died in his throat as he looked down at Winston. The dog was staring at him, unblinking, his head slightly tilted. It was the same look he had seen 1,000 times. The same look Winston had given him when he accidentally rearranged Victor's equations on the whiteboard. The same look he had given him when he had accidentally solved Victor's chessboard puzzle. The same look he had given him all these years, like he was waiting for Victor to catch up. A slow, terrible realization crept up Victor's spine. Winston wasn't just smart. He understood, and now, The FBI wanted him. Victor clenched his fists. If you're saying what I think you're saying, then he's more valuable than you're letting on, which means I'm not letting you take him. The agent's eyes darkened. That's not your decision, Mr. Lancaster. Something in her voice told Victor she had already made up her mind. Winston must have sensed it too because, for the first time since the agents arrived, he moved. Slowly, deliberately, Winston stepped forward, positioning himself between Victor and the agents. His tail didn't wag, his ears didn't flatten. Instead, he did something Victor had never seen before. He nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was unmistakable. The agents stiffened. The lead agent exhaled sharply, as if confirming something she had already suspected. Victor felt his pulse skyrocket. "You saw that, didn't you?" he murmured. The agent nodded grimly. "He's ready." Victor turned to Winston, his throat dry. "Ready for what?" Winston just stared at him. The lead agent straightened her coat. "Mr. Lancaster, we don't have time for debates. We need him now. He understands that. So do you." Victor gritted his teeth. "And what if I say no?" The agent's expression remained unreadable. "Then we take him anyway." A heavy silence fell between them. Victor's heartbeat thundered in his ears. They weren't bluffing. They weren't asking. He looked down at Winston, at the dog that had been his companion for years. The dog that had sat beside him during sleepless nights, that had quietly corrected his work without ever revealing how. And now, Winston had made a decision. Victor inhaled, forcing his hands to steady. "If he goes, I go," he said. The agent blinked. "Excuse me?" Victor squared his shoulders. "You need Winston, fine. But he's my responsibility. I'm not letting you take him without me." The agents exchanged glances. The lead agent's lips pressed into a thin line, but after a moment, she gave a curt nod. "Fine. Pack your things. We leave in an hour." Victor's stomach twisted, but he forced a slow nod. He turned to Winston, who met his gaze, unwavering. "Looks like we're in this together," Victor murmured. For the first time in a long time, Winston wagged his tail. The hour passed in a blur. Victor packed a single duffel bag, throwing in clothes, his laptop, and, without quite knowing why, the old photograph he always kept in his desk drawer. Winston didn't move as Victor moved around the house. It was as if the dog already knew what was happening, as if this was something he had expected for years. By the time they stepped outside, the agents were waiting with a black SUV. Victor climbed into the back seat, and Winston jumped in beside him without hesitation. The moment the doors shut, Victor felt the weight of it settle into his bones. There was no going back now. As the car pulled away from the mansion, Victor's gaze lingered on the place he had built. His empire, his solitude, and now he was leaving it all behind for a dog that wasn't really a dog. The SUV sped through the winding roads, heading toward an unknown destination. Victor turned to the agent. "Where exactly are we going?" The agent didn't look at him. "Classified location." Victor let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it is." He glanced at Winston. The dog was looking out the window, eyes scanning the passing trees as if memorizing every detail. Victor exhaled, a strange unease settling over him. This wasn't just a mission, something much, much bigger was at play, and whatever it was, Winston already knew the outcome. The black SUV sliced through the empty highway, moving deeper into the unknown. The city lights faded into the distance, swallowed by the endless sprawl of the countryside. Victor sat rigid in the back seat, his mind a battlefield of unanswered questions. Beside him, Winston remained still, his golden eyes locked onto the window. He wasn't just looking, he was analyzing, tracking, absorbing every detail. Victor had always believed himself to be the smartest man in the room. He built machines that outpaced human intelligence, revolutionized the way technology interacted with the world. But now, for the first time, he felt small. Because Winston wasn't just an anomaly, he was something more. The lead agent, seated in the passenger seat, finally broke the silence. "We need to set some ground rules," she said, her voice clipped. Victor scoffed. "Rules? You barge into my house, demand my dog, and now you want to give me rules?" The agent ignored his sarcasm. "Once we arrive at the facility, you'll have restricted access. No wandering, no asking questions beyond what we allow. You'll stay in designated areas, unless instructed otherwise." Victor leaned forward, narrowing his eyes. "And what happens if I break your precious rules?" The agent turned slightly, her steel-gray eyes meeting his. "Then we send you home, without Winston." Victor clenched his jaw. She had just played her strongest card. He knew it, and so did she. He leaned back, his pulse steady, though his mind raced with 1,000 scenarios. Fine. Play along. Gather information. Find out what they wanted. And most importantly, find a way to protect Winston. The car veered off the highway onto a nearly invisible dirt road, flanked by towering pines. The deeper they drove, the more Victor's stomach knotted. The air itself seemed heavier, thick with something unseen. Then, through the trees, he saw it. A facility. No, a fortress. It was a sprawling, brutalist compound, surrounded by high steel fences topped with razor wire. Floodlights bathed the entire perimeter in an artificial glow, casting long shadows against the cold concrete walls. Armed guards patrolled the entrance, their faces impassive, their movements precise. Victor exhaled slowly. This wasn't a research center. It was a black site. The SUV approached the main gate, where a security checkpoint loomed ahead. The guards barely acknowledged them before scanning a biometric panel, allowing the massive steel doors to slide open. As they entered, Victor felt the shift, the unspoken hum of secrecy, the feeling of stepping into a place where things happened that the world would never know about. The SUV came to a stop in a dimly lit underground garage. The doors unlocked with a soft click, and the agent gestured for Victor to exit. He did. Winston followed without hesitation. No leash, no command, just silent obedience. It wasn't normal, it never had been. A man in a white lab coat stood waiting for them. He was older, his hair graying at the temples, his sharp blue eyes carrying the weight of someone who had seen too much. "Dr. Lancaster," he said, extending a hand. "Welcome." Victor ignored the gesture. "Who are you?" The man smiled slightly. "Dr. Elias Monroe, Director of Special Research." Victor crossed his arms. "And what exactly are you researching?" Dr. Monroe's gaze flickered to Winston, then back to Victor. "Why don't we discuss that inside?" Victor clenched his teeth but followed. The hallways were sleek and sterile, lined with reinforced glass panels. Behind them, Victor caught glimpses of things, machines humming with energy, screens flashing with indecipherable data, and personnel moving with calculated efficiency. This was a place of purpose, a place where every second counted. And Winston. Winston walked beside him as if he had been here before. Finally, they arrived at a high-security door. Monroe pressed his palm against a biometric scanner, and the door slid open with a soft hiss. Inside was a large observation room, but what it overlooked made Victor's blood run cold. Below them, through a massive reinforced window, was a chamber, and inside the chamber, more dogs. But they weren't like Winston. These were different breeds, different sizes, all equipped with strange neural interfaces attached to their heads. Some paced restlessly, while others sat unnervingly still, their eyes vacant, their movements robotic. Victor felt his throat tighten. What the hell is this? Monroe folded his hands behind his back. The next step in intelligence evolution. Victor turned to him sharply. You're experimenting on them. Monroe didn't flinch. We're unlocking potential. Victor's hands curled into fists. And what does Winston have to do with this? Monroe finally turned, his gaze unreadable. He's the first success. The word sent a bolt of ice through Victor's veins. The first, Monroe nodded. The others, they've adapted, but only to a degree. Winston is different. We believe he isn't just enhanced. He paused. He's aware. The word lingered in the air, heavy with implication. Victor turned to Winston, who stood beside him, watching the chamber below with an expression Victor had never seen before. It wasn't fear, it was recognition, understanding. Victor's mind reeled. He had always known Winston was extraordinary, but this was something far beyond what he had imagined. You want to control him, don't you? Victor said quietly. Monroe sighed. We want to understand him. But yes, control is part of it. Can you imagine the applications? Tactical operations? High-level reconnaissance? Even psychological warfare? He isn't just a dog, Doctor. Lancaster. He turned, his eyes sharp. He's a weapon. Victor's pulse hammered against his ribs. He looked down at Winston, who was still unreadable. A weapon. Was that what Winston had been all along? Or was he something even more dangerous? Something they didn't fully understand? Victor swallowed hard. He had built his life on intelligence, on pushing boundaries. But now, he realized, some things were never meant to be controlled. And Winston had already made his decision. Victor had to make his. But he had a sinking feeling that he wasn't the one who was truly in control. Not anymore. Victor's breath came slow and steady, but his mind was in chaos. He stood before the massive glass window, staring down at the chamber filled with dogs. No, test subjects. Their eyes were distant, some flickering with something unnatural, others dull and vacant, their bodies rigid and unnervingly still. Neural implants ran along their skulls like parasites, thin wires trailing from their heads into unseen machines. Winston, however, stood beside him, untouched. Whole. Victor turned sharply to Monroe. You think you've turned them into something greater? His voice was low, dangerous. They look broken. Monroe remained unshaken. Progress always comes with failures. Science is about iteration. Winston is the only true success. Victor's stomach churned. And what exactly makes him different? Monroe clasped his hands behind his back. That's what we've been trying to determine. The other subjects, their enhancements remain limited. We've amplified cognitive abilities, but there's always a plateau. Winston, on the other hand, he glanced at the golden retriever, standing motionless at Victor's side. He has no ceiling. Victor swallowed. You're saying he's… what? Evolving? Yes. The word sent ice down Victor's spine. For so long he had ignored the signs. How Winston seemed to understand things beyond instinct. How his intelligence didn't feel trained, but innate. And now, here was the answer staring him in the face. Winston wasn't just smart. He was changing, becoming something else. Victor looked down at him. Winston didn't move, didn't react, but Victor felt something unsettling in the air. It was like standing next to a bomb with no idea when it would go off. Monroe continued. We've analyzed every possibility. Genetic mutations, enhanced cognition due to environmental factors, even neural plasticity beyond normal canine limits. He turned, his voice dropping lower, but none of those explain Winston's true anomaly. Victor exhaled sharply. Which is, Monroe met his eyes. He understands abstract thought. Victor froze. That's impossible. Monroe gestured toward the glass. Is it? Because I think you've known for a long time that it's not. Victor looked at Winston again, searching for answers in those golden eyes. Abstract thought. That was what separated man from animal. The ability to grasp concepts beyond survival, beyond instinct, to comprehend morality, time, self-awareness. It was the difference between following orders and making choices. A chill ran through Victor. You're trying to control him, he murmured. That's why you brought us here. Monroe didn't deny it. We've worked for years to unlock what Winston already possesses, and if we can replicate it." He turned back toward the observation chamber. Imagine the possibilities. Victor's skin crawled. He had built artificial intelligence his entire life, spent years designing programs that mimicked human thought. But this was different. This wasn't code. This was life. He clenched his fists. And what if he doesn't want to be controlled? Monroe didn't blink. Then we make sure he doesn't have a choice. The room went silent. Victor's pulse thundered. He had known this was a mistake the moment the FBI showed up at his door, but now there was no denying it. Winston wasn't here to be studied. He was here to be used, and they wouldn't stop until they had broken him like the others. Victor turned, moving toward the door. "We're leaving." Monroe sighed, shaking his head. "I'm afraid that's not an option, Dr. Lancaster." The door slid shut with a mechanical hiss. Victor's stomach twisted. The guards standing at the entrance, silent until now, shifted, their hands hovering near their weapons. Victor turned to Monroe, voice tight. "You don't understand what you're doing." Monroe didn't move. "No, you don't understand what Winston is. We're not just unlocking intelligence, Victor. We're unlocking the future." Victor's jaw clenched. And what if he doesn't want that future? Monroe smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the thing about evolution, Dr. Lancaster. It doesn't care what we want. It just happens." Victor's hands curled into fists. He wasn't a fighter, but if it came down to it, he'd do whatever it took to get Winston out of here. And then, a low growl cut through the silence. Victor turned. Winston's body was tense, his golden fur bristling. His teeth bared ever so slightly, but it wasn't a warning. It was a decision. A choice. Victor had never seen him like this before. Monroe tilted his head. "Fascinating," he murmured. "He's assessing the situation." Victor didn't hesitate. "Winston," he said quietly, "we have to go. Now." The dog's ears flicked, and then the lights flickered. Victor's breath caught. The overhead fluorescence buzzed violently, then cut out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. A second later, emergency lights bathed everything in deep crimson. An alarm blared overhead. Chaos erupted. Shouts rang out as guards reached for their weapons. Monroe spun toward the control panel, his fingers flying across the keys. Victor didn't stop to think. He moved. "Winston, run!" The retriever sprang into action, a blur of gold and muscle. Winston lunged forward, not toward the guards, but toward the control panel. Monroe barely had time to react before Winston slammed into him, knocking him aside. Screens shattered, sparks flying as the room erupted into confusion. Victor bolted for the exit, yanking open the emergency override panel. His fingers fumbled over the buttons, his heart slamming against his ribs. Then, the doors unlocked. "Come on!" Victor shouted. Winston leapt toward him, and they were through the door before the guards could react. Gunfire rang out, bullets striking the reinforced glass behind them. Victor sprinted down the corridor, his lungs burning. Winston ran beside him, his movements precise, calculating. Victor didn't know how much time they had. But he knew one thing. They weren't just escaping. They were fighting back. And Winston, he was leading the way. The blaring alarm vibrated through Victor's skull as he sprinted down the corridor, Winston at his side. The facility's sterile white walls blurred past him, bathed in the flickering crimson glow of the emergency lights. Behind them, the guards were regrouping. Orders were shouted, boots thundered against the polished floors, and Victor knew they wouldn't make it out easily. "Winston left," he gasped. The dog veered sharply before Victor had even finished speaking, as if already aware of the path ahead. A second later, gunfire exploded behind them, ricocheting off the walls, shattering glass panels. Victor ducked, adrenaline flooding his veins. Jesus. Winston remained eerily calm, muscles coiled with deadly precision. He wasn't just running, he was calculating. Victor's lungs burned as they burst through a set of metal doors into a dimly lit control room. Screens flickered wildly, emergency systems struggling to recalibrate. The room smelled of static, hot wiring, and something acrid, like burnt metal. Victor slammed the door shut behind them, locking it manually. "That'll buy us a few seconds," he panted. Winston, unfazed, jumped onto the main console, his paws landing on the keyboard with purpose. Victor blinked. "Winston, what are you—" A sudden shift in the room made his words die in his throat. The monitors surrounding them, previously displaying security footage, now flickered in unison, then shut off entirely. A deep hum filled the space, as though the entire system was rebooting. And then, lines of code flooded the screens. Rapid, unreadable strings of data, flashing faster than Victor could process. It wasn't random. It was structured. It was intentional. Victor's breath caught. He turned to Winston. The dog's eyes glowed in the dim light, reflecting the storm of cascading code on the screens. And in that moment, Victor understood. Winston wasn't just evolving, he had already surpassed them. "Jesus Christ," Victor whispered. The pounding on the door snapped him back to reality. "Get it open!" Someone barked from the other side. Victor's pulse spiked. "Winston, whatever you're doing, do it fast." The retriever didn't react, not in the way a normal dog would. He simply continued. His paws moved with precision, pressing key combinations Victor knew weren't random. Lines of text flashed. Security override engaged. Facility lockdown initiated. Victor's heart leapt into his throat. "You're shutting the place down?" The screens blared red. "Total system failure imminent." A second later, the overhead lights flickered once, then cut out completely, and the screaming began. From behind the locked door, Victor heard the shouts of guards, panicked voices yelling over one another as every piece of technology in the facility crashed in unison. Then, something worse. The distant mechanical hiss of the containment chambers being forcibly unlocked. Victor's stomach dropped. The other dogs. Winston jumped down from the console. His eyes met Victor's, unblinking, certain, and suddenly, Victor understood. The experiment wasn't just about controlling Winston, it was about replicating him. And now, those failed attempts were loose. The banging on the door stopped, replaced by silence, a deep, unsettling silence. Then, a low growl, not from Winston. Victor turned cold. Shit, metal screeched as something heavy slammed against the door. Then again. Then, the steel bent inward like it was paper. Victor's instincts screamed at him to run. "Winston!" The dog moved first. In a blur of gold and muscle, Winston darted toward the secondary exit. Victor followed without hesitation, bursting into another hallway. Behind them, the door caved in entirely. A monstrous shape lunged through the opening. It was a dog, but wrong. A husky, or at least, it had been. Its fur was patchy, its movements off. Twitchy. Wires jutted from its skull, and its eyes, were pitch black, vacant, soulless, and it wasn't alone. 3 more emerged from the shadows, all bearing the same horrifying features. The failed experiments. Victor barely had time to react before they charged. "Go!" he shouted. Winston didn't hesitate. They tore through the facility's underbelly, weaving through collapsed security gates and darkened labs. The air was thick with the scent of burning circuitry, and in the distance, alarms wailed uselessly. Victor risked a glance behind them. The creatures were gaining. "Winston, options. A normal dog wouldn't understand that command." Winston did. He barked sharply. Once, a signal. Then, without warning, he veered right into a side corridor. Victor followed, trusting blindly. Ahead, a large emergency exit sign glowed faintly in the dark. Victor's heart surged. There, they reached the door. Victor rammed into it, forcing it open. And then, pain. Blinding, searing pain. Something tore into his shoulder, claws raking deep, burning through fabric and skin. Victor screamed, stumbling forward. The weight behind him was massive. One of the failed dogs had caught up. Its snarling, metal-laced jaws snapped inches from his neck. It was strong, too strong. Victor fought, vision swimming, and then Winston struck. A blur of gold collided with the beast, knocking it back with terrifying force. Winston didn't just bite, he calculated. His jaws clamped down at the exact point where the exposed wires met the creature's skull. A sickening crack. The beast spasmed violently. Then, nothing. It collapsed. Victor gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder. Jesus! But Winston didn't stop. He turned, hackles raised, baring his fangs at the remaining failed experiments. A warning. The creatures hesitated. Then, something incredible happened. Winston barked. Not just a sound. A command. The failed experiments flinched, staggered. Their vacant black eyes flickered, uncertainty rippling through their broken forms. And then, they backed away. Victor's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. The remaining creatures didn't attack. They simply watched, and in their black, lifeless eyes, for the briefest moment, Victor swore he saw recognition. Then Winston turned to him. No hesitation, no fear, just a choice. He nudged Victor toward the door. Victor swallowed hard, adrenaline screaming through his veins. They didn't have time for questions. He pushed forward, through the emergency exit, into the night. The cold air slammed into him like a wall. They were out, but it wasn't over, because now they weren't just running. They were being hunted, and Winston. He was the only one who knew what came next. The cold night air clawed at Victor's skin as he staggered through the dense forest, his breath ragged, his shoulder burning from the deep gash left by the failed experiment's claws. Every heartbeat sent a sharp pulse of pain radiating through his body, but he couldn't stop. Not now. Winston moved beside him, his golden fur darkened by dirt and streaks of something Victor didn't want to acknowledge. The dog was limping slightly, but his eyes remained alert, ears twitching at every sound. He wasn't just running, he was tracking. Behind them, the facility loomed in the distance, its floodlights piercing through the trees like searchlights, cutting through the thick fog rolling in from the mountains. The alarms had finally died, but Victor knew they were still being hunted. The failed experiments wouldn't stop, and neither would the people who had created them. Victor sucked in a sharp breath, wincing as he pressed a trembling hand to his shoulder. His fingers came away slick with blood. He was losing too much. Winston noticed. The retriever slowed, then stopped entirely, turning his intelligent gaze toward Victor. His tail lowered, ears pressing back slightly. Concern. Victor let out a dry laugh. Now you're worried? He exhaled heavily, leaning against a tree for support. You should be worried about them. He tilted his head toward the shadows behind them. Winston didn't move. Victor swallowed hard. We can't keep running. His voice was hoarse. We need a plan. Winston's head tilted ever so slightly, the way it always did when he was thinking. And then, he turned and walked away. Victor stiffened. Hey, where the hell? He stumbled after the dog, forcing his legs to move. You don't get to just... Winston disappeared into the trees. Victor cursed under his breath but forced himself to follow. They moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the facility's artificial glow, into the untouched blackness of the forest. Every branch that snapped beneath Victor's boots felt like a gunshot in the silence. His body ached, his mind swam, but he trusted Winston. He had to. Minutes stretched into eternity before Winston finally stopped. Victor nearly collapsed against a fallen log, his limbs trembling. He struggled to catch his breath before looking around. It was a clearing. No, not just a clearing. A cave. Half hidden beneath a thick wall of overgrown brush, a narrow opening led into the earth. The entrance was small, just big enough for a man to crawl through. Victor turned to Winston. You planned this? His voice was thick with disbelief. Winston's tail gave the smallest flick. Victor let out a breathy chuckle, shaking his head. Of course you did. His legs barely carried him as he dropped to his knees and crawled through the opening, dragging his battered body inside. Winston followed silently. The inside of the cave was cool and dry, the stone walls smooth from centuries of wind and water. It wasn't deep, just enough space to keep them hidden. But for now, it was enough. Victor leaned back against the wall, exhaling. He had escaped. But at what cost? For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then, Winston sat beside him. And Victor, exhausted, injured, and lost, did something he hadn't done in years. He spoke. I don't know what to do. His voice was barely a whisper. For the first time in my life, I have no idea what to do. Winston watched him, his amber eyes reflecting the dim light. Victor let out a weak, bitter laugh. You're supposed to be my dog, my responsibility. And yet, he shook his head. You're the one saving me. Winston blinked slowly. Victor closed his eyes for a moment. His mind drifted back to a different time. A different life, a woman's laughter, warm and bright, soft hands running through his hair. You work too much, Victor. A faded photograph tucked inside his pocket, edges worn from years of being held. He reached for it now, his fingers brushing over the creased paper. He pulled it out, staring at the image of the woman beneath the sycamore tree. She was gone. And so was the version of himself that once felt. Victor swallowed hard, lowering the photo to his lap. I built my life around control, he murmured. Control over technology, control over my company, control over myself. His hands trembled. But I never controlled you, did I? He looked at Winston. You were never mine to control. Winston didn't move. Victor exhaled shakily, his exhaustion settling into his bones. They're going to keep coming, aren't they? The dog didn't nod, didn't bark, but Victor already knew the answer. Yeah, he whispered. I thought so. The weight of reality pressed down on him. They had nowhere to go. No allies. No plan. Victor let his head rest against the cave wall, staring at the darkness beyond. For the first time, it hit him. He might not make it out of this. He might not survive. And for the first time in years, he wasn't afraid. Because next to him, Winston stayed. Silent. Loyal. Unbroken. A quiet understanding passed between them. No matter what happened next, they would face it together, and that was enough. For now, the night wrapped around them like a predator, heavy with silence, broken only by Victor's ragged breathing and the distant hum of something unnatural moving through the trees. His pulse pounded in his ears, mixing with the distant echoes of the facility alarms. Alarms that meant one thing: they were still being hunted. Victor leaned against the rough bark of a tree, trying to steady himself. His body ached, his shoulder burned, but the pain barely registered anymore. His mind was too sharp, too hyper-aware of the deadly reality closing in around them. Winston stood beside him, his golden fur bristling under the cold moonlight. His ears twitched, eyes scanning the darkness, calculating. He wasn't just on alert, he was expecting them. Victor swallowed hard. They had made it this far, but it wasn't enough. The people chasing them, Monroe's men, the agents, the scientists, they weren't going to give up, and neither were the creatures they had created. A branch snapped in the distance. Victor's stomach clenched. Winston's head whipped toward the sound. His muscles coiled, his breath slow and even. Victor knew that stance. It meant one thing: they weren't alone. A low growl rumbled through the trees. Not Winston's. One of them. The failed experiments. Victor didn't need to see them to know they were there. He could feel it. The weight of something unnatural watching from the shadows, something waiting, something wrong, and then a blur of movement. The first one lunged. Victor barely had time to move before Winston launched forward. The impact was brutal, fur, muscle, and steel colliding mid-air. They hit the ground hard, rolling into the dirt. Winston twisted, slamming his opponent down with a force Victor had never seen from a dog before. But the creature didn't react like a dog. It moved with inhuman precision, too smooth, too calculated. Its black, lifeless eyes flickered with something unreadable as it scrambled back to its feet. Then it lunged again. Victor barely had time to think before another shape emerged from the darkness. Then another. They were surrounded. 3. No, 4 of them now, stepping forward in eerie synchronization, their bodies twitching, mechanical implants glowing faintly beneath their patchy fur. Victor's pulse skyrocketed. The experiments weren't just hunting them, they were studying them, waiting for an opening. Victor gritted his teeth. He could barely stand, barely fight. But Winston was ready. The golden retriever squared his stance, his teeth bared, his body eerily still, and then he barked. Loud, commanding. The failed experiments hesitated. Victor saw it again, that flicker of something in their blank eyes. A hesitation, a moment of doubt. They weren't just machines. There was something inside them, something fighting to break free. Victor's breath caught, but the moment was gone. Their implants sparked, their bodies jerking, Monroe's failsafe kicking in, and just like that, they attacked. The first one lunged at Winston. The retriever dodged, his movements impossibly precise. He wasn't just reacting, he was predicting. He sidestepped, then struck, his teeth clamping down on the exact spot where the creature's cybernetic enhancements met flesh. The result was instantaneous. A high-pitched whine tore through the air as the experiment spasmed, its system overloaded. It crumpled to the ground, unmoving. Victor barely had time to process it before another lunged for him. He swung wildly with the branch in his hands. It connected, but it wasn't enough. The beast barely flinched before twisting toward him, its soulless black eyes locking onto his. Victor's stomach dropped. He wasn't going to survive this one. Then, Winston struck again. He leapt, slamming into the creature's side, sending it crashing to the ground. But this time, Winston didn't attack. He didn't bite. He stared, and something passed between them, a moment too strange, too impossible to put into words. The experiment froze. Its muscles twitched, its eyes flickering, not with aggression, but with recognition. For a split second, it wasn't a machine. It was something else. Then, a spotlight tore through the trees. Victor's blood ran cold. The distant hum of helicopters roared overhead. Then a voice. Victor Lancaster. Stop running. Victor's hands curled into fists. Monroe had found them. The failed experiments turned, not toward Victor, but toward the floodlights in the sky. Victor's stomach dropped. They weren't going to run. They were going to fight. Gunfire exploded through the trees, and the experiments, they attacked. Not Victor, not Winston. They turned on the soldiers. Victor barely had time to process it before chaos erupted. The creatures leapt, tearing through Monroe's men with terrifying efficiency. Bullets tore through the air, but they barely slowed the experiments down. Victor knew what was happening. Their implants, designed to suppress pain, fear, hesitation, were turning them into perfect killers, and for the first time, they weren't obeying. They were choosing to destroy the ones who had made them. Victor grabbed Winston's fur, his breath sharp. Run! They bolted, through the trees, away from the chaos, away from the flashing lights, the screams, the fire. Victor's mind reeled. Everything was unraveling. The experiments were breaking free. Winston had caused it. Had he planned it? Had he known all along that this would happen? Victor didn't know. He wasn't sure he wanted to know. All he knew was that the hunt was over, and now the real fight was about to begin. Victor ran. Branches tore at his skin, his breath burned in his throat, but he kept going. He had no other choice. The echoes of gunfire rattled through the forest, distant but relentless, a grim reminder that Monroe's men weren't giving up. The facility was behind them now, burning, crumbling, but the fight was far from over. The helicopters still swept the sky above, their searchlights cutting through the treetops, hunting, circling like predators scenting blood. Victor's shoulder ached from the wound he had sustained earlier. He could feel the dampness of his own blood against his skin, but the pain didn't matter. Only survival mattered. Only Winston mattered. The retriever ran ahead of him, fast and sure, his golden fur blending into the darkness. He didn't hesitate. Every twist and turn, every decision, Winston made them as though he had been here before. Victor trusted him blindly. Then Winston stopped. Victor barely skidded to a halt before crashing into him. What? Winston's ears flicked, his body tensed. And that was when Victor knew. They weren't alone. A shadow shifted in the underbrush. Not a soldier, not a human. One of them. Victor's stomach twisted. A cybernetic husky stepped into the moonlight, its black, soulless eyes locking onto Winston. Victor's breath hitched. The thing was injured. Blood dripped from a wound in its side, dark against its silver-gray fur. But it didn't lunge. It didn't snarl. It just watched. Victor's fingers tightened around the broken branch in his hands. He knew how this went. The experiments never hesitated. They attacked. So why wasn't this one moving? Victor turned to Winston. The retriever stood completely still, his amber eyes locked onto the husky. He wasn't afraid. He was studying. And then, Winston barked. Short, sharp, commanding. The husky flinched. Victor sucked in a breath. Something flickered behind the creature's dead eyes. A hesitation, a moment of doubt. Victor's heart pounded. They were supposed to be mindless, programmed, controlled. But this one was choosing. Victor barely breathed as the husky took a slow, staggering step back. Then, it sat down. Victor nearly collapsed. What the hell? His voice was barely a whisper, lost in the night. He turned to Winston. What did you do? Winston didn't react. He simply stood there, calm, composed, as if this had been his plan all along. Victor swallowed. The failed experiments weren't failures at all. They weren't just weapons. They were learning. They were evolving. And Winston was leading them. Victor's fingers trembled. His entire life had been built on logic, on equations, on things that made sense. But nothing about this made sense. And yet, the valley was quiet. Not the kind of silence that came from death, but the kind that followed a battle when the dust settled, and both the victors and the defeated realized what had been lost. Victor's breath came slow and unsteady, his hands trembling as he knelt beside the fallen husky. Blood darkened the dirt beneath its unmoving body, its cybernetic limbs twitching slightly before going still. The husky had saved Winston, and now it was gone. Winston stood beside him, unmoving, his amber eyes locked onto the body of the one who had shielded him. His chest rose and fell in slow, deliberate breaths, but Victor could see the weight pressing on him, the grief, the understanding. The husky had chosen to stand with them, and it had paid for that choice. A soft whine escaped Winston's throat, barely audible over the distant hum of retreating helicopters. The fight was over, but it hadn't come without a cost. Victor exhaled, forcing himself to look away from the husky's body. His gaze traveled over the battlefield, where Monroe's forces had been forced into retreat. Soldiers, once so sure of their victory, now limped away in defeat, weapons discarded, some barely able to stand. The failed experiments, no, the survivors, stood among them, silent, watching. They had not wiped out their former captors. They had not killed for vengeance. They had simply fought for their freedom. And they had won. Victor's throat tightened. He had spent his life believing intelligence could be designed, that consciousness could be controlled. He had built machines that mimicked life, that mimicked thought. But this was something far beyond that. Winston had not been programmed. He had become. And now the others were following in his footsteps. Victor slowly pushed himself to his feet, every muscle in his body screaming in protest. Blood still dripped from his shoulder wound, soaking his torn shirt. But the pain was distant now. More than anything, he felt empty. Not from loss, not from exhaustion, but from the sheer magnitude of what had just happened. Winston turned his head slightly, his gaze meeting Victor's. And in that moment, Victor realized this wasn't over. It was just the beginning. The aftermath. The survivors had gathered in the center of the valley, their bodies tense, waiting. Some of them were wounded, their cybernetic enhancements sparking faintly, but they stood firm. The soldiers who had remained, those who had not fled in the chaos, watched them with wary eyes, their weapons lowered but not discarded. A fragile peace hung between them. Victor stepped forward. Every eye turned toward him. He hesitated. What was he supposed to say? That they were free? That they had won? That the war was over? Because it wasn't. Not really. The facility was destroyed, Monroe's forces scattered, but they were still experiments, still outcasts. The world had no place for them, no home, no future. And yet, Victor looked at Winston, at the golden retriever who had led them here. Winston had made a future for himself, and now he would do the same for them. Victor let out a slow breath. His body ached, his mind swam with exhaustion, but his voice was steady when he finally spoke. "You're free now." The words felt too small, too simple, but the weight of them was undeniable. The survivors shifted, their expressions unreadable. Free. The concept was foreign to them. Victor swallowed hard. He turned to the remaining soldiers, the ones who had once followed Monroe without question. "They aren't your enemies," Victor said. "They never were." One of the soldiers, a young man with dirt streaked across his face, hesitated before stepping forward. His hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. He swallowed. "I didn't know. We were just following orders." Victor's chest tightened. He had spent years thinking intelligence was about logic, about programming. But intelligence was choice. And now they all had to choose. Victor nodded. Then stopped following. The young soldier hesitated. Then, slowly, he nodded back. One by one, the remaining soldiers dropped their weapons. A new understanding settled over the battlefield, not as enemies, not as captors and captives, but as beings who had been forced into a war none of them had ever wanted. The war was over, and now the hard part would begin. The future they created. They buried the husky at the edge of the valley. It wasn't much, just a patch of dirt beneath an old tree, but Winston sat beside the grave for a long time, unmoving, his head lowered. Victor sat beside him. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The loss was real, but so was the choice that had been made. Victor ran a hand down Winston's back, his fingers brushing against the dog's golden fur. "You did it," he murmured. Winston didn't react, but he didn't need to. They both knew the truth. The world had changed, and now they had to decide what came next. 1 week later, the remnants of Monroe's operation had crumbled. The facility was destroyed. The scientists had disappeared, scattering into the wind, trying to erase the evidence of what they had done. But it was too late. The world knew. Victor stood in front of a small screen, watching the news report flicker across the old television. Government officials have confirmed the existence of a classified research facility conducting unauthorized experiments on canines. While many details remain unclear, leaked footage from an anonymous source has raised ethical concerns regarding artificial intelligence and genetic modification. Investigations are ongoing. Victor turned away. It was done. Monroe was gone. But Winston wasn't. Victor stepped outside. The survivors had made a home here, deep in the valley, away from the eyes of the world. They were still learning, still changing, and Winston was teaching them. The retriever stood among them, watching as they moved together, adjusting, evolving. They were no longer machines, no longer weapons. They were something new. Victor exhaled slowly. He had spent his life designing intelligence, and now he was witnessing its next evolution. Not in machines, not in programs, but in them, in Winston. In the choice to be more. Victor stepped forward, and for the first time in a long time, he wasn't afraid. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine through the valley. The fires from the battle had long since burned out, leaving only charred remnants of the old world behind. What remained was something raw, something new. Victor stood at the edge of a makeshift shelter, his gaze sweeping over the survivors as they moved. They were adapting, not just to their surroundings, but to freedom. For so long they had been controlled, conditioned, owned. Their lives had been dictated by orders and algorithms, their choices stripped away before they ever had the chance to make them. But now, there were no commands, no programming, only possibility. Victor exhaled slowly. This wasn't what he had expected. When he had fled the facility with Winston, he had thought only of survival, of escaping Monroe, of disappearing into the world, of hiding. But Winston had seen further. Winston had known. This wasn't just about escaping. This was about starting over. And now, standing in the midst of what had once been nothing but a battlefield, Victor realized this was home. Not the cold steel walls of the life he had left behind. Not the endless corridors of the research facilities where he had spent years chasing knowledge. Here, among them, among the ones who had been discarded and forgotten, the ones who had never been given a choice until Winston had given them one. Victor swallowed hard, rubbing a hand down his face. He hadn't slept in days. His shoulder still ached from the wound he had taken during the escape, but the pain didn't matter. Not anymore. A leader. Without a crown. Winston sat beside him, his golden fur gleaming in the soft morning light. His ears twitched slightly as he listened, always listening. Victor turned to him, shaking his head with a quiet chuckle. "You knew all along, didn't you?" Winston didn't react. But he didn't have to. Victor already knew the answer. He had spent years believing that intelligence was something to be created, something built from code, from structure, from logic. But Winston wasn't programmed. Winston had become. And now, the others were following in his footsteps. Victor watched as two of the cybernetic huskies interacted near the river's edge. One pawed curiously at the water, watching the ripples spread outward. The other hesitated, then stepped forward, mimicking the first. Learning. Not through instruction, not through commands, through experience, through choice. Victor let out a slow breath. The government would never understand this. To them, intelligence was something measurable, something quantifiable, something that could be controlled. But this wasn't just intelligence. This was evolution, and Winston was leading it. The world had not forgotten. Victor knew it was only a matter of time. Monroe was gone. The facility was in ruins. But the people who had built it, the people who had funded it, wouldn't just let it go. They would come looking, not just for the survivors, for him, for Winston. They wouldn't see what Victor saw. They wouldn't see the choice, the consciousness, the freedom that had been forged here. They would see assets, loose ends that needed to be tied up. Victor clenched his fists. He wouldn't let them take this away, not after everything, not after all they had lost. His gaze drifted upward, toward the pale sky, where the first sign of trouble had already appeared. A drone. Small. Silent. Watching. Victor's jaw tightened. They had been found. Winston lifted his head, his amber eyes tracking the drone with eerie precision. He had expected this. He had prepared for this. Victor inhaled sharply. "We're not running this time." The retriever blinked once. Then he stood. And without hesitation, he walked forward. Victor followed, because the fight wasn't over, And Winston wasn't done changing the world. Not yet. The world had tried to control Winston, to shape him into something predictable, something owned. But intelligence couldn't be chained, freedom couldn't be programmed. And now, Winston had chosen his own future. The question is, what would you choose? Would you follow orders, accept the world as it is? Or would you break free, step into the unknown, and forge something new? Because sometimes, the greatest intelligence isn't the ability to think, it's the courage to decide. If Winston's story made you think, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you believe in freedom, in choice, join us. Subscribe. The future is ours to create.